He abandoned his wife for infertility, but her secret would turn his world upside down. Welcome. Remember to subscribe and activate the notifications. Enjoy. His heart pounding, Mark scattered the powder into Julia's smoothie. A smirk played on his lips, but that smile faded abruptly when he heard a creak from the bedroom door. She had just stepped out of bed, earlier than usual. He knew she would never accept his preference for a carefree life without the burden of children. Every day, his determination to keep things the same grew stronger. He needed to ensure that nothing disrupted the comfortable, child-free existence he valued so much. If that meant betraying Julia's trust, so be it. Mark and Julia had been married for 5 years, their relationship appearing perfect to those around them. Mark was a successful businessman, admired for his sharp mind and easy charm. Julia, with her kind smile and nurturing nature, was a dedicated teacher, loved by her students and respected by her colleagues. They were the couple everyone thought had it all: a beautiful home, fulfilling careers, and a love that seemed unshakable. To the outside world, they were the epitome of happiness. Julia had always dreamed of becoming a mother. She spoke often about the joys of raising a family, painting vivid pictures of what their future could be. Mark, however, never shared her enthusiasm. To him, the idea of children was more a threat than a promise. He enjoyed his life just the way it was, structured, predictable, and free from the chaos that a child would inevitably bring. His days were filled with meetings, social events, and business trips. His nights, more often than not, involved entertaining clients or enjoying the company of friends. His life was a well-oiled machine, and he had no desire to introduce a new, unpredictable element into it. The moment Julia mentioned starting a family, Mark felt his carefully constructed world begin to tremble. He didn't feel fear in the traditional sense, but a sense of discomfort at the thought of change. The freedom to come and go as he pleased, the ability to focus entirely on his career, and the lack of responsibility beyond himself. These were the things he cherished. He knew that having a child would shift the focus away from his desires and onto the needs of another. He wasn't prepared to make that sacrifice, and the more Julia spoke of children, the more resolved he became to maintain the status quo. It was at a business event that Mark met Lily. She was young, full of life, and exuded a sense of fun that was infectious. Unlike Julia, who had started to focus more on domesticity and family life, Lily represented everything that Mark felt he would lose if they had children. With Lily, there were no discussions about baby names or nursery colors. There were no expectations of a settled life. She was content to live in the moment, enjoying the thrill of their secret affair. Mark found in Lily an escape from the growing tension at home. Her carefree attitude and youthful energy made him feel invigorated, like a man half his age. Their affair began almost effortlessly. A few lingering glances at the event, a casual conversation that quickly turned flirtatious, and soon enough they were meeting in private, away from prying eyes. Lily made him feel alive, unburdened by the thoughts of the future. She had no interest in a serious relationship or the demands of a family. This lack of expectation suited Mark perfectly. With her, he found the freedom he feared he might lose, and this emboldened his decision to take matters into his own hands. Back home, as Julia spoke about starting a family, Mark nodded along, masking his indifference. His thoughts were far from the nursery they might one day decorate. Instead, he thought of his next meeting with Lily, the next time he could escape the expectations that weighed him down. He began to see Julia's desire for children not as a shared dream, but as an obstacle to his happiness. He needed to find a way to keep his life as it was, to protect his freedom. It was during one of these moments of reflection that the idea came to him. Contraceptive pills were easy to acquire. He could add them to Julia's morning milkshake, a ritual she rarely missed. He reasoned that this would give him more time. He could maintain their life without the added complication of a child. It wasn't fear that motivated him, but rather a desire to control his environment, to keep things predictable. The pills were his insurance, his way of ensuring that nothing changed. Mark justified his actions by telling himself that Julia would never understand his perspective. She was too caught up in her dream of motherhood to see things as he did. He convinced himself that he was doing the right thing for both of them. After all, their life was good as it was. Why risk ruining it with the complications a child would bring? Each morning, as he added the pills to her drink, he felt a sense of calm. He was in control. He was protecting their life together, or so he told himself. As months passed, Julia became more anxious about their inability to conceive. She spent hours researching infertility, seeking answers and solutions. She talked to Mark about fertility treatments, about seeing a specialist. Mark listened, offering half-hearted reassurances while inwardly feeling a sense of relief. The more anxious Julia became, the more he felt justified in his actions. He continued to sabotage their chances of having a child, confident that he was preserving their happiness. Mark's affair with Lily continued to flourish. They took spontaneous trips, attended exclusive parties, and lived a life that was light and carefree. With her, Mark felt none of the pressure he experienced at home. She never asked about the future or mentioned children. Their relationship was simple, based on mutual enjoyment rather than obligations. Mark found himself spending more and more time with her, finding excuses to be away from Julia. The more he distanced himself from his wife, the less guilty he felt about his deception. He began to see his life with Julia as a burden, a constant reminder of the expectations he didn't want to meet. His life had become a delicate balancing act, maintaining the appearance of a devoted husband while living a separate life with Lily. As he moved between these two worlds, he felt a sense of satisfaction at his ability to manage both. He convinced himself that as long as Julia remained in the dark about his actions, everything would be fine. He had control, and as long as he had control, he could keep his life exactly as he wanted it. But in the quiet moments when the house was still and Julia was asleep, Mark sometimes felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't guilt, he was sure of that. Perhaps it was a fleeting recognition of the fragility of his deception, a momentary awareness that lies, no matter how carefully constructed, could unravel. But these thoughts were easily dismissed. As long as he was careful, as long as he played his part, there was no reason why he couldn't continue living the life he had chosen. And so Mark stood in the kitchen each morning, the bottle of pills in his pocket, and watched as Julia prepared her coffee, oblivious to the secret he kept. He felt a sense of power in his deception, a belief that he was the master of his own fate. He would do whatever it took to keep his life just as it was, even if it meant betraying the woman who loved him. For Mark, freedom was all that mattered, and he would ensure that nothing, not even the promise of a family, would take that away from him. Months passed, and Julia's optimism slowly gave way to anxiety. Each month brought another disappointment, another reminder that their attempts to start a family were failing. At first, Julia tried to dismiss her worries, telling herself that these things took time. But as the months turned into a year, her concern grew. She began to suspect that something was wrong. Julia immersed herself in research, spending hours on the internet reading about infertility. She ordered books on the subject, highlighting passages that spoke about age-related issues, dietary changes, and stress factors. She even joined online forums where women shared their struggles and successes, seeking comfort in the knowledge that others had faced similar challenges and found solutions. Despite the reassurances she found, her anxiety continued to grow. The thought that she might be unable to have children weighed heavily on her. Mark, meanwhile, played his role as the supportive husband, offering comforting words whenever Julia expressed her fears. He would wrap his arms around her, telling her that everything would be fine, that they just needed to relax and let nature take its course. His voice was always calm, his demeanor relaxed, but his reassurances felt hollow. Julia could sense a lack of genuine concern in his responses, but she brushed it off, thinking that maybe he was just trying to keep her from worrying too much. Mark's internal satisfaction grew with each passing day. He watched as Julia's desperation increased, confident in his belief that he was maintaining control of their situation. His morning routine had become second nature, preparing Julia's milkshake and adding the contraceptive pills with the same casual ease as someone adding sugar to coffee. He felt no guilt, only a sense of relief that his life would remain unchanged. As Julia's anxiety deepened, she became more insistent on finding a solution. She spoke about scheduling an appointment with a fertility specialist, wanting to understand what might be causing their difficulty in conceiving. Mark listened, nodding and agreeing that it would be a good idea, but he always found a way to delay the process. He would agree to an appointment only to cancel it at the last minute, citing work emergencies or other commitments. He would suggest that they try natural methods for a little longer, convincing Julia that seeing a specialist might be unnecessary. Julia's frustration grew as Mark continued to make excuses. She couldn't understand why he was so hesitant to seek professional help. To her, it seemed like the logical next step. Her patience began to wear thin, and she found herself feeling resentful. She wanted to believe that Mark was as committed to having a child as she was, but his actions made her question his sincerity. Despite her doubts, she pushed forward, determined to do everything possible to make their dream of starting a family a reality. Mark's subtle manipulation extended beyond delaying the fertility appointments. He began planting seeds of doubt in Julia's mind, suggesting that maybe their inability to conceive was a sign that they weren't meant to be parents. He would make offhand comments about how some couples were just better off without children, how their lives were already fulfilling and complete without the added stress of a baby. These comments, seemingly innocent, were calculated to make Julia question their path. He knew that if he could shift her mindset, even slightly, it would make it easier for him to maintain control. Julia, however, remained resolute. Her longing for a child was too strong to be easily swayed by Mark's suggestions. She could not imagine a future without children, and the idea of giving up was unthinkable. Her determination fueled her actions, pushing her to explore every possible avenue to conceive. She started changing her diet, incorporating fertility-boosting foods, and even trying herbal remedies she read about online. She began tracking her ovulation cycles meticulously, convinced that careful planning would eventually lead to success. While Julia poured her energy into finding solutions, Mark poured his into his affair with Lily. Their relationship had grown more intense, fueled by the freedom and excitement that Lily represented. Mark found himself craving the time he spent with her, the sense of escape she provided from the growing tension at home. Lily never questioned him about his personal life, never demanded more than he was willing to give. With her, there were no expectations of the future, no discussions about children. Their relationship was based on mutual enjoyment, and Mark relished the simplicity of it. The more time Mark spent with Lily, the more he saw his life with Julia as a burden. He began to resent the conversations about fertility, the constant pressure to start a family. Julia's hopes and dreams were a weight he didn't want to carry. He found himself making excuses to be away from home, attending more business meetings, taking more trips, anything to avoid the growing demands of his marriage. With each passing day, his connection to Julia weakened, while his bond with Lily strengthened. Mark's affair provided him with the perfect outlet for his frustrations. With Lily, he could be himself without the need to pretend. He didn't have to put on a show of being the supportive husband. He didn't have to listen to discussions about children or deal with the emotional weight of Julia's despair. Lily represented everything he wanted, a life free from responsibility, full of pleasure and freedom. As their relationship deepened, Mark began to see his future with Julia as increasingly incompatible with his desires. Despite the growing distance between them, Julia continued to believe that their struggles were temporary. She held on to the hope that they would find a solution, that one day they would be able to hold their child in their arms. She tried to ignore the small signs that something was amiss, the way Mark's attention seemed to drift, the way he avoided certain conversations. She convinced herself that his reluctance was simply due to stress from work, that once they found a solution, everything would be back to normal. Mark's manipulation had worked its way into the fabric of their relationship, creating an environment where Julia blamed herself for their problems. She saw herself as the cause of their difficulties, wondering what she could do differently to make things right. Mark's subtle hints had taken root, making her question her own worthiness as a mother. He had succeeded in diverting the focus away from himself and onto her, ensuring that she remained in the dark about his true intentions. In his mind, Mark saw himself as a master of his own destiny. He believed that he could continue to live his double life indefinitely, balancing his marriage with Julia and his affair with Lily. He saw no reason why he couldn't have it all: freedom, pleasure, and the illusion of a perfect marriage. He felt no remorse for his actions, only a sense of satisfaction at his ability to control the narrative. As Julia's desperation grew, so did Mark's confidence. He was certain that he had found the perfect solution to his problem, a way to keep his life exactly as he wanted it. He had convinced himself that he was doing what was best for both of them, protecting their happiness by maintaining the status quo. In his mind, Julia would eventually come to accept their childless state, and they would continue their lives without the upheaval that a baby would bring. Mark's deception had become a part of their daily routine, so ingrained that he no longer thought twice about it. He had created a reality where he was free from the responsibilities he feared, a reality that allowed him to pursue his own desires without consequence. His life was a carefully constructed facade, and as long as Julia remained unaware, he believed he could keep it intact. But the cracks were beginning to show. Julia's determination to find answers was growing stronger, and Mark's indifference was becoming harder to mask. The balance he had worked so hard to maintain was becoming increasingly precarious. Even as he felt secure in his control, the seeds of his eventual downfall had been sown. The life he had so carefully constructed was built on lies, and lies, no matter how well crafted, have a way of unraveling. As Mark continued to live his double life, convinced of his own invincibility, he remained blind to the reality that was slowly closing in around him. His desire to keep his life unchanged had set him on a path that could only lead to one outcome, an inevitable collision with the truth he had worked so hard to bury. Mark continued his daily routine, carefully adding the contraceptive pills to Julia's morning milkshake. He watched her closely as she drank, feeling a sense of satisfaction at his ability to control their situation without her ever knowing. To him, it was a simple solution to a complex problem. He maintained the appearance of a supportive husband, all while ensuring that their life remained free from the complications of parenthood. Julia's desperation grew with each passing month. She felt a constant weight of disappointment and self-doubt. The dream of motherhood, once so vivid and close, seemed to slip further away with each negative pregnancy test. She became more vocal about her desire to see a specialist, convinced that there must be a solution to their infertility. Mark, sensing that his control was beginning to slip, knew he needed to act before Julia's determination led to the truth. One morning, Julia woke to find Mark already in the kitchen, staring out the window with a distant look in his eyes. She watched him for a moment, noticing the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders were hunched, as if carrying an invisible burden. It was a stark contrast to the carefree man she had married. She approached him, placing a hand on his arm, trying to bridge the growing distance between them. Mark turned to face her, his expression unreadable, his mind racing with a decision he knew he had to make. Mark had realized that the longer he let things continue, the greater the risk of exposure. He needed to take control, to end the marriage on his terms before Julia could uncover his deception. He had to make her believe that the fault lay with her, not him. It was the only way to protect his secret, to maintain his freedom. Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to do. He looked at Julia, his eyes cold and calculating. He told her that he had been thinking a lot about their situation, that he could no longer ignore the fact that their inability to conceive was causing a strain on their marriage. He said that he had tried to be supportive, to be patient, but he couldn't pretend any longer. He blamed her for their childlessness, telling her that he believed she was the reason they couldn't have children. His words were sharp, each one a deliberate cut designed to inflict the most damage. Julia's face paled as she listened, her eyes widening in disbelief. She had never imagined that Mark would blame her, that he would accuse her of being the problem. His words felt like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She stammered, trying to form a response, but Mark cut her off, his voice hardening. He told her that he wanted a divorce, that he couldn't see a future with someone who couldn't give him the family he desired. He painted a picture of his own unhappiness, making her feel as though she had failed him in the most fundamental way. Julia stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. She had always believed that their love could withstand any challenge, that they would face their struggles together. Mark's accusations shattered that belief. She felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. The man she thought she knew, the man she had trusted with her heart, was looking at her with eyes full of blame and resentment. She felt a wave of nausea, a sickening realization that her world was falling apart. Mark's voice continued, relentless, as he detailed how their marriage had become a source of stress, how he no longer found joy in their life together. He accused her of being obsessed with having a child, of letting it consume her to the point where nothing else mattered. He claimed that he had been patient, had tried to make things work, but he couldn't do it anymore. His words were carefully chosen, each one a calculated strike designed to break her down, to make her believe that she was the cause of their problems. Julia's vision blurred with tears as she listened. She had spent months blaming herself for their inability to conceive, and now Mark was confirming her deepest fears. She felt humiliated, exposed, as though her most private insecurities were being laid bare. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but Mark's accusations left her feeling powerless. She could only stand there, silent and shattered, as he continued to tear apart the life they had built together. Mark saw the effect his words were having, and he felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. He had succeeded in shifting the blame, in making Julia believe that she was the one at fault. It was a cruel strategy, but it was necessary. He needed her to be too broken, too consumed by guilt to question his actions. He watched as the fight drained out of her, as her shoulders slumped and her eyes filled with tears. He knew that he had won, that he had successfully diverted attention away from his own deception. Mark declared that he would be moving out, that he needed space to think, to figure out what he wanted. He left Julia standing alone in the kitchen, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a physical force. She felt numb, her mind unable to fully grasp the reality of what had just happened. The future she had imagined, the family she had longed for, had been torn away in an instant. She sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. The days that followed were a blur of pain and confusion. Julia felt as though she was moving through a fog, her emotions swinging between anger, sadness, and despair. She replayed Mark's words over and over in her mind, each repetition cutting deeper into her heart. She couldn't understand how things had gone so wrong, how the man she loved could be so cold and unfeeling. She blamed herself, convinced that she was the reason their marriage had fallen apart. Mark, meanwhile, wasted no time in distancing himself from Julia. He moved into a hotel, telling her that he needed time to think. In reality, he felt liberated, free from the burden of maintaining his facade. He resumed his affair with Lily, finding comfort in her carefree presence. With Lily, there were no accusations, no expectations. She didn't care about his past or his reasons for leaving Julia. She only cared about the here and now, about enjoying life without the constraints of commitment. Mark felt a sense of victory. He had managed to extract himself from his marriage without his secret being discovered. He was free to live his life as he pleased, without the fear of being tied down by a family. He congratulated himself on his cleverness, convinced that he had made the right decision. As far as he was concerned, his life was finally back under his control. Julia, left alone in the house that had once been filled with the promise of a future, struggled to find her footing. She was haunted by Mark's accusations, his coldness, and the finality of his decision. She wanted to understand, to make sense of what had happened, but the answers eluded her. She felt lost, adrift in a sea of pain with no anchor to hold on to. The image of the life she had wanted, the family she had dreamed of, was a constant presence in her mind. She couldn't accept that it was gone, that Mark had walked away from it so easily. She clung to the hope that there was still a chance, that they could find a way to heal, to rebuild what had been broken. But deep down, she knew that the man who had stood in the kitchen, accusing her of being the cause of their problems, was not the man she had fallen in love with. He was a stranger, and she was beginning to realize that the life they had shared was built on lies. Mark had succeeded in breaking her heart, but he had also set in motion a chain of events that would lead to his own downfall. Julia's pain, her sense of betrayal, would drive her to seek the truth, and when she did, the carefully constructed lies that Mark had relied on would come crashing down. The pills hidden in the kitchen, the secret he had so carefully guarded, would be exposed. And in that moment, the balance of power would shift, revealing the truth that Mark had tried so hard to bury. Julia's life became a blur of confusion and sorrow after Mark left. Each day felt like a struggle to simply get out of bed and go through the motions. She found herself replaying Mark's accusations over and over, trying to make sense of how everything had fallen apart so quickly. The idea that she was infertile had shaken her to the core. She had always imagined herself as a mother, and now that future seemed impossibly out of reach. Her mind was a whirlwind of guilt and self-blame, haunted by the belief that she had failed Mark and failed herself. Despite the emotional turmoil, a small part of Julia refused to accept Mark's version of events. The longer she sat with the pain, the more certain she became that there was something he wasn't telling her. His sudden accusations, his decision to leave so abruptly, all felt out of character for the man she thought she knew. Her instincts told her that there was more to the story, that Mark was hiding something. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she sought were within her reach, if only she had the strength to find them. Determined to uncover the truth, Julia decided to take matters into her own hands. She scheduled an appointment with a fertility specialist, refusing to rely solely on Mark's accusations. She needed to know, once and for all, if she was truly the reason they couldn't conceive. The days leading up to the appointment were filled with anxiety and uncertainty, but Julia knew she had to face her fears. She could no longer live in the shadow of Mark's words, doubting herself and her worth. The appointment came and Julia sat nervously in the doctor's office, her heart pounding as she waited for the results. When the doctor finally spoke, his words brought a flood of relief and confusion. The test showed no signs of infertility. Julia was perfectly healthy, fully capable of conceiving. The news was like a ray of light piercing through the darkness that had enveloped her. For a moment, she felt a sense of hope, a renewed belief in the future she had once dreamed of. But the relief was quickly replaced by a burning question. If she wasn't the reason they couldn't have children, then what was? Julia's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the doctor's words. She replayed the events of the past months, the tension that had grown between her and Mark, his sudden accusations, and the way he had left. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, forming a picture that filled her with dread. Mark's behavior, his constant excuses to avoid seeing a specialist, his coldness, it all pointed to something she hadn't wanted to consider. Mark had been lying to her. Fueled by a mix of anger and determination, Julia returned home with a newfound resolve. She knew she needed to dig deeper, to find out what Mark had been hiding. Her suspicions centered on the moment she had seen him in the kitchen, his furtive actions as he prepared her milkshake. She had pushed the thought aside at the time, unwilling to believe that Mark could be capable of such deceit. But now, with the knowledge that she was not infertile, her mind kept returning to that moment. Julia began searching through the house, determined to find evidence of Mark's deception. She went through the drawers, cabinets, and closets, looking for anything that might explain his behavior. Her frustration grew as she found nothing, her hope beginning to wane. It was only when she reached the kitchen that she felt a flicker of possibility. She remembered the way Mark had been standing near the blender, the way he had turned his back when she entered the room. She opened the cabinets above the counter, her hands shaking as she rifled through the contents. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual assortment of kitchen items. But then, behind a stack of old recipe books, she found it. A small bottle, hidden from view, with a label that made her blood run cold. Contraceptive pills prescribed to Mark. Julia stared at the bottle, her mind reeling. The reality of what she was holding crashed over her, bringing with it a flood of emotions. Mark had been sabotaging their chances of having a child. He had been lying to her, manipulating her, all while pretending to be the supportive husband. Rage, betrayal, and heartbreak surged through Julia as she gripped the bottle. The man she had loved and trusted had taken away her dream of motherhood, not because of anything she had done, but because of his own selfish desire to maintain his freedom. Mark's accusations, his coldness, his decision to leave, all of it had been a cover for his own lies. He had made her believe that she was the problem, that she was the reason their marriage had fallen apart. And all the while, he had been secretly ensuring that they would never have a child. The full weight of Mark's betrayal settled over Julia, filling her with a fury she had never known. Her hands shook as she thought of all the times she had blamed herself, all the nights she had cried over their inability to conceive. She had carried the burden of guilt and shame, believing that she had failed as a wife. And all along it had been Mark's deceit, his cowardice, that had destroyed their marriage. The realization was like a knife to the heart, cutting deeper than any of his accusations. Julia knew she couldn't keep this to herself. Mark's lies had stolen so much from her, her trust, her happiness, her sense of self. She wouldn't let him get away with it. She decided then and there to confront him, to expose the truth of what he had done. She would no longer be the victim of his manipulation. Mark had shattered her world, but she would not let him walk away unscathed. She would make sure that everyone knew the truth, that his carefully crafted facade was nothing more than a web of lies. With a bottle of pills clutched in her hand, Julia reached for her phone. She called Mark, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. She told him they needed to talk, that she had discovered something important. Mark agreed, his tone indifferent, as though he had already moved on from their marriage. Julia felt a surge of anger at his casual response, but she swallowed it down, determined to remain composed. This confrontation would be on her terms, not his. They met later that day in the house they had once shared. Mark arrived, his expression cool and detached. He had expected a plea for reconciliation, a desperate attempt to win him back. He was prepared to dismiss her, to end things on his own terms. What he wasn't prepared for was the cold, hard look in Julia's eyes, the way she stood tall, a bottle of pills in her hand. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the label, the carefully hidden evidence of his deception. Julia's voice was calm, steady, as she laid the bottle on the table between them. She spoke of her appointment with the fertility specialist, the results that showed she was not the problem. She detailed her search through the house, how she had found the pills, and what that discovery meant. Each word was a blow, stripping away the lies Mark had built around himself. He felt the walls closing in, his control slipping through his fingers. Mark tried to deny it, to come up with an excuse, but Julia's eyes bored into him, unflinching. She laid out the facts, each one a nail in the coffin of his deceit. She told him she had been prepared to take the blame, to carry the burden of their failure. But now she knew the truth. Mark had never wanted a child, had never intended to let them conceive. He had lied, manipulated, and controlled her, all to maintain his precious freedom. Julia's voice rose with each accusation, her anger and betrayal pouring out. Mark stood there, his mind scrambling for a way to regain control, but he could find none. He had underestimated Julia, had believed she would never discover his secret, and now, standing in the light of her truth, he realized that his lies had finally caught up with him. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. With a final steely look, Julia made her intentions clear. She would not let Mark walk away unscathed. She would tell their friends, their families, everyone who had ever admired Mark for the man he pretended to be. She would expose his lies, reveal the true nature of the man who had betrayed her. Mark's reputation, his carefully maintained image, would be shattered, just as he had shattered her dreams. Mark left the house that day, his mind reeling from the confrontation. He had always believed he could control the outcome, that his lies would remain hidden. But Julia's discovery had upended everything. As he drove away, the bottle of pills burned in his mind, a symbol of his own downfall. The truth he had tried so hard to bury had been unearthed, and he knew there was no escaping the consequences. Julia watched him go, a mix of sadness and satisfaction in her heart. She had loved Mark, had trusted him with everything she had, and he had repaid her with lies. But now she was taking back her power, reclaiming the truth that had been stolen from her. She had been broken, but she was no longer a victim. Mark's betrayal had opened her eyes, and she would ensure that his deceit was brought to light. As she stood in the doorway of the home they had once shared, she felt a sense of closure, a release from the pain that had held her captive. The truth had set her free, and she would use it to rebuild her life. 10 years had passed since the day Mark walked out of the home he had shared with Julia. In the years that followed, he had lived the life he had always envisioned for himself, a life free from responsibility, commitment, and the burdens of family. He had traveled extensively, jumping from one relationship to another, enjoying the freedom of his bachelor lifestyle. He surrounded himself with people who admired his success, people who didn't ask questions about his past. For a time, it seemed that Mark had managed to escape the consequences of his actions, living a life that was as carefree as he had always wanted. But beneath the surface, Mark found himself increasingly dissatisfied. The thrill of new relationships began to fade, and the constant pursuit of pleasure left him feeling empty. The years of indulgence, of avoiding any meaningful connection, had taken their toll. He had what he thought he wanted: freedom, success in the absence of responsibility, but the satisfaction he once found in these things was diminishing. Despite his best efforts to keep it at bay, a sense of loneliness crept in, a realization that his life lacked depth and purpose. It was during this time of reflection that Mark met Clara. She was younger than him by nearly 2 decades, full of life and ambition. Clara was different from the women Mark had been involved with over the years. She was serious about her future, about building a life that meant something. Her youthful energy and optimism drew Mark in, making him feel invigorated. For the first time in a long while, he found himself considering a different kind of life, one that included stability, a long-term relationship, and perhaps even a family. Mark and Clara's relationship blossomed quickly. They moved in together, and for a time, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. Clara spoke often about her dreams of having children, of raising a family in the city where they lived. Mark, who had spent years avoiding the subject, found himself entertaining the idea. He told himself that he had changed, that he was ready to embrace a future that once terrified him. The prospect of fatherhood, which had once felt like a chain around his neck, now seemed like a possibility he could accept. Months passed, and Mark and Clara began trying to conceive. At first, they approached it casually, expecting nature to take its course. But as the months went by without success, Clara grew concerned. She suggested they both get tested to ensure there were no underlying issues. Mark, remembering the accusations he had once hurled at Julia, felt a pang of unease. He had been so certain back then, so confident that he was not the problem. But now the idea that something might be wrong with him crept into his mind. Reluctantly, Mark agreed to the tests, reassuring Clara that everything would be fine. He tried to maintain his usual composure, telling himself that there was no reason to worry. But as they sat in the doctor's office waiting for the results, a sense of dread settled over him. When the doctor finally spoke, the words hit Mark like a blow. He was infertile. The diagnosis was definitive, leaving no room for doubt. The news left him stunned, struggling to process the reality of what he was hearing. Mark felt a rush of emotions: shock, disbelief, and a bitter irony that cut deep. He remembered the lies he had told Julia, the accusations he had made to shift the blame away from himself. He had spent years convincing himself that he was free from the responsibilities of parenthood by choice. Now he realized that choice had been an illusion. The truth was that he had never had the option of becoming a father. The life he had run from, the life he had feared, had never been within his reach. Clara's reaction was one of heartbreak. She had always dreamed of having children, of raising a family. The news that Mark was infertile shattered those dreams. She tried to mask her disappointment, to offer support, but Mark could see the truth in her eyes. Clara, who had once looked at him with admiration and hope, now saw him as a man who couldn't give her the future she wanted. Her love for him wasn't enough to overcome her desire for a family. The days that followed were filled with tension. Clara became distant, her once lively demeanor replaced by a somber resignation. Mark watched as the light in her eyes faded, replaced by the same emptiness he had tried so hard to avoid. He knew what was coming, And when Clara finally sat him down to talk, he wasn't surprised. She told him that she couldn't continue their relationship, that she needed to be with someone who could give her the family she desired. Her words were gentle, but the pain behind them was unmistakable. Mark listened, feeling a numbness settle over him. He had heard these words before, but in a different context. He had been the one to say them to Julia, to accuse her of being the problem. Now the tables had turned, and he was the one being left behind. Clara's decision to leave was a mirror image of the choice he had made years ago, and the irony of the situation was not lost on him. He was reaping the consequences of the life he had chosen, the lies he had told. The day Clara moved out, Mark found himself alone in their apartment, surrounded by the silence of his own thoughts. He replayed the events of the past decade, the choices he had made, the people he had hurt. The satisfaction he once felt from his freedom was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. He realized that in his pursuit of a life free from responsibility, he had lost the very things that gave life meaning: love, trust, and connection. A week later, Mark found himself back in the doctor's office, there to discuss his options. The waiting room was quiet, filled with the muffled sounds of soft conversations and the rustling of magazines. Mark sat alone, lost in thought, when the door opened and a familiar figure stepped inside. It was Julia. She looked different, but in a way that was hard to define. She carried herself with a sense of peace, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Her face was bright, and she was accompanied by two young children, their laughter filling the room. Mark watched, frozen, as Julia checked in at the reception desk. She hadn't seen him yet, her attention focused on the children at her side. Mark's heart pounded as he took in the sight before him. The family he had once denied her, now a reality. He felt a mix of emotions: regret, longing, and a deep sense of shame. Julia had found the happiness he had taken from her, had built the life he had refused to give. And as he watched her, he realized that she had moved on, had found joy and love in ways he never could. Julia turned, and their eyes met. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Mark braced himself for anger, for a confrontation, but Julia's face softened into a smile. She approached him, the children clinging to her hands, their eyes curious. Mark stood, feeling awkward and unsure, his mind racing with the things he wanted to say. But before he could speak, Julia greeted him warmly, her voice kind and sincere. Julia introduced him to her children, their bright eyes and innocent smiles, a testament to the life she had built. Mark felt a lump in his throat, unable to find the words. He looked at Julia, expecting bitterness or resentment, but found only compassion. She told him that she had forgiven him long ago, that she had moved on from the pain he had caused. She hoped that he could find peace, that he could come to terms with his choices and find a way to heal. Mark listened, his emotions a tangled mess. Julia's kindness was unexpected, and it cut deeper than any words of anger could. He realized that she had found happiness, had built a life that was full and complete. She had become the person she was always meant to be: a mother, a wife, and someone who had learned to forgive. Mark, on the other hand, was left to face the emptiness of his own choices, the lies that had brought him to this point. As Julia turned to leave, holding her children's hands, Mark felt a wave of regret wash over him. He watched her walk away, the sound of the children's laughter echoing in his ears. He had spent years convincing himself that he had made the right choices, that his freedom was worth any cost. But now, faced with the reality of his own emptiness, he realized how wrong he had been. Julia's forgiveness was a gift, but it only served to highlight the void in his own life. Mark left the doctor's office that day, his mind heavy with the weight of his past. He had lived a life of lies, had hurt the people who had cared for him, all in the name of freedom. And now, at 50 years old, he found himself alone, without the connections that gave life meaning. Julia's words echoed in his mind, a reminder that forgiveness was possible, but that true peace could only come from within. He knew that the path to redemption would be a long one, and he was finally ready to face the consequences of his actions. As Mark walked through the streets of the city he had once shared with Julia, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known before. He had spent so long running from responsibility, from commitment, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly live. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with the shadows of his past, but for the first time, Mark was willing to confront them. He had lost so much, but he still had a chance to find a way forward, and perhaps in time he would learn to forgive himself. I hope you loved the story. The next video is just a click away, so don't forget to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. A big thanks, and see you in the next story.